Hello, everyone. This is a review of Exam 1 notes. And so this should cover about 95, 96% of what you'll see on the exam. Like I said earlier, the exam is open notes, so you may have any handwritten or printed notes with you. You can't use other windows or tabs on the computer, but you should feel free to reference any notes that are sitting next to you and things like that. I will not be giving out this note because I expect you to review the video and then make your own notes. It would be too easy to just hand everybody this. But let's get started. So we're going to start with HTML declarations. And so this snippet right here that says !dot type HTML will go at the beginning of your HTML file. Specifically for HTML5 and onwards, and that just tells the browser, hey, this is an HTML document, so that the browser knows what to do when it actually renders it on a screen. There's two types of elements. There's semantic and non-semantic. What does that mean? Semantic elements are elements with a meaning, and so when you read their name, they inform the user, oh, this is probably what kind of content we're expecting inside them. And so we all have some familiarity of what a form or a table is. When I'm talking about a form, I'm talking about ingesting information from the user. When we're talking about tables, we're displaying data to a user. And so when we use the form element or a table element or tag, users know what we're talking about, what kind of content is going to be inside those. So those are called semantic elements. Non-semantic elements like a div or a span, that doesn't tell us anything. I don't know what a div is, what is inside a div. And so when you're creating a website, you want to use semantic elements as much as possible. I know we've used divs a lot, but really we want to rely on articles, and tables, and forms. And if we don't have a choice, then we'll rely on a div. And so for presenting data, we're going to try to use a semantic element like a table, and we're not going to try to make a table out of divs. That's all that's saying over there. A minimum HTML document. And so at minimum, this is a properly valid HTML document. It has the doc type declaration at the beginning, then it has the HTML tag, then it has a head, and inside the head we have meta and title. This meta char set UTF-8 is just saying this is the kind of keyboard encoding this document will use, and most HTML files you'll see use a UTF-8 encoding. Then we have the title, which is what you'll see at the top of the tab or the browser window. And the stuff inside a head, you're not going to see visibly on the screen. That's all going to be in the body. So the body is all your page content. Your head is just metadata that the browser knows how to use, or just other meta information. Next, we have 8 attributes. So HTML elements have the name of the element at the beginning, and then they can have attributes. So the attributes just convey more information for the element. So without the href, all we know is that we're creating a link. And a tag means a link, but we don't know where that's going to. And so the href attribute has the information of where do we want to go from here, which is what we refer to as the target document. And so in this case, we have the a tag in our web page with href, a link to w3schools.com. In this case, we're telling the a tag to use this as a target document by setting the href attribute. And so another example of this is when we tell the image tag to use a certain image as a source. And so this is the attribute right here for the image element. Next, we have block level versus inline level elements. And so say we have a div, right? A div is kind of like a paragraph. And inside the div, we put in a span. And so when we put the span in and we wrote inline element in there, it didn't mess up the div. The div is going right here, then we have the span, and then the div keeps going after that. But check out what happens down here. So we have the div, and then we put a p tag in here, a paragraph tag, and then we close the paragraph tag. When that rendered, we have the div, and then we have a new line for the paragraph, and then we have a new line for the div to continue. So block level elements, they exist on their own. They need a new line before and after them. Inline just fall right into place. And that's what that inline means. Inline means I'm just going to fall into this line, whereas block means I want my own block. And you can use CSS to override block elements to be inline or inline to be block, but that's the fundamental difference there. Next, let's cover CSS. So we have three ways of adding CSS to a page. We have external, internal, and then inline. External, which is what we covered in the previous lesson, involves creating a separate file from your HTML file called whatever you want .css. So in this example, we're going to add this line into our HTML file into the head section, which is right inside the head. We're going to copy a link tag with the attribute relation style sheet. We're telling it, hey, I want you to grab the style sheet from this file. We're going to link it to the target document, which is mystyle.css. So in the same folder where I have my web page, I'm also going to have a separate file called mystyle.css, and that's where all my style is going to be. And so that's an example of external CSS. It is by far the most used in the industry, and this is what you want to be using for almost all of your styling. I'll tell you when we need exceptions in a minute here. So internal CSS may only be used or may be used if a single HTML page has a unique style. So say all your pages look one way and you have external CSS styles for them, but then you need one page that's completely different. Could be for whatever reason. Say you have all the events, say you have a visitors page for events in your city, but you need Halloween events to have a spooky style and all the other ones are the same. You would just add some internal CSS into the Halloween page by adding this section right here inside the head. So instead of a link in the head section, you're going to add a tag called style, and then you're going to put your styles in there, and then you're going to close it. And so now that style is imported into the page and it only affects this page. Next, we have inline, which is our third way to apply CSS styles, and that is applying CSS styles straight to the element. So instead of declaring, hey, I want the body to have a background color in an external file or in that HTML page, we're actually going to go straight to the element. So in this case, we're going to the p tag and we're saying this paragraph needs to be colored red. This is the least used way of styling CSS because when you want to manage styles for a huge website, it's hard to go to every single element and find the style and update it. And then you have to update it in 1,000 different places because you have 1,000 elements. And so this is rarely used unless you have one unique single element that needs that style, and then you can decide to make that call. So that's the third style, is inline. And then in any of these three ways, you're adding CSS, but CSS is one same language. And so regardless of which way you're using CSS in an HTML page, CSS always looks the same. And so inside the style tag, if you want to apply a style to all of your H2s, your header 2s, you're going to just put H2 and then the style in here. So if you want all your H2s to have the color blue, you just put color blue. Now all your H2s are going to be blue. Say you only want some of your H2s to be blue and some to be purple, and the rest of your H2s to be the regular H2. Now what you're going to do is you're going to create a class called .h2blue. So if you have a dot before the name, that's going to be a class. So this can be, now you can set that class to all of your H2s. So if you have an H2 that you want to apply H2 purple to, you'll just put class equals dot H2 purple. Now, whatever styles you put in here will be applied to any H2s with the class H2 purple. So this is the least specific because it would apply to any H2. These are more specific because it would apply to any H2s with the class H2 blue. Lastly, and the most specific is applying by ID. ID, we already have a concept of IDs. You all have student IDs. Everybody can only have one unique ID. Two students should not have the same ID. And the same concept is here. So two elements cannot have the same ID. That's not valid HTML. And so this is the most specific because you can have a first name field and you want to apply certain styles to that. You just put that style in here and you start that name with a hashtag, and that means you're creating an ID. And so then if I want to apply this to, say, an H1, I'll just put H1 ID equals first name. Now the styles that we put in here get applied to this and only this because you can only have one element with the ID first name. So to apply something to a class, you're using period before the name. To apply it to an ID, you're using hashtag. To apply it to multiple elements, say you want all your H2s and H3s to be the color yellow. You'll just put H2, comma H3, color yellow. What that helps with is it keeps everything consistent and more readable. And so all your H2 and H3 styles are right over here. And if you want to change this to something else, that'll update all the H2s and H3s. So it's a handy way of updating all your certain elements at one time, because you can even add P here and H1 here, and now you can control all those with the same one tag. Another thing you can do is this. And so when you have a space between two elements, that means I want to style every H3 inside an H2 yellow. So that won't style any H3 that's like just in the body. But if it, oh, this doesn't work because you wouldn't have an H3 inside of an H2, but you might have an H3 inside of a div. And so say you have an H3 in a div. Now any H3 inside of a div will have the color yellow. So hope that makes sense. Then we're go on to the box model. So you have your content, which could be a paragraph or an image. That content is surrounded by three boxes. And so we're boxed in by a padding, a border, and a margin. So the padding is the space between the image and its border. And so if you increase the padding 10 pixels, 20 pixels, that's just going to increase the distance between that image and the border. If you increase the margin, say you have a paragraph and an image, if you increase the margin, it's going to increase the space between the two contents. So it's a nice way to organize space around elements, to move them around on a web page. That's what we use the box model for. And they do not include the width or height of an element. So say an element is 50 pixels by 50 pixels. And say you give it a 10 pixel padding and a 20 pixel border, that doesn't change the original size of 50 by 50. The content is still 50 by 50. It's just the space around it is growing with these other things that are around it. You can add these box models selectively. So you can say, oh, I only want a margin dash top or border dash left or margin dash right. And it'll only put that in that one spot where you asked for it. So Padding left, we'll put it over here, border top up here, things like that. There's also shorthand, so I imagine this would get tiring to keep adding the manual margin top, right, bottom, especially if you have a lot of different styles. So here's some shorthand. Margin 25, 50, 75, 100 pixels. This means that I want 25 at the top, 50 at the right, 75 at the bottom, and 100 at the left. Okay, so these are in the conventions. And if you follow the convention, it'll style it just like that. So top, right, bottom, left. So it starts from the top and goes clockwise. If your left and right margins are going to be the same, we just need one number in the middle. So say you want your left and right to be 50, you're just going to put 25, 50, 75, and then 50 will apply to both left and right. So you'll just have top, left, right, and bottom. Navigation. You could build a navigation using unordered or ordered list elements. And we did this in our band or concert webpage in the navigation section. So an unordered list starts with a UL. So I'll show you an example here. UL meaning unordered list with li tags inside. And so an unordered list doesn't have an order. So the browser will just provide bullet points before them. Now an ordered list, OL, implies that there is an order, that link 1 needs to come before link 2. So when the browser displays it, it's going to display numbers. It'll look like 1 dot link 1 and 2 dot link 2. And so I believe we used unordered lists in our band concert project, and so that's why you had bullets for the links. You can also use a CSS style called list style type, and I believe in that lab we asked for list style type to be none, but there are other options. And so instead of the bullet, you can show a disk, which is what I think the bullet is. You could have none, which means that we're not going to show a bullet at all or anything there. There's square, which means we want to show squared bullets. And lastly, circle, which I believe is like a circle outline with a hole in the middle. So different kinds of bullet choices here, but really easy to build navigation using lists. Next, we have font families. And so in CSS, we use the font family property to specify what font we want for the text. If the font name is longer than one word, we're going to put in quotes. And so Times New Roman is many words. And so the CSS parser is going to have trouble understanding what this is. So that's why we wrap it in quotes to tell it, hey, this is just one font. So you want to wrap any font name with more than one word in quotations. And then you want to give it multiple fonts so that it can fall back. So not every browser or every computer is going to have access to all the fonts in the world because there's like millions. But at its basic, it'll have access to a serif font or a sans serif font, a cursive font. And so it needs to fall back if it can't find whatever font you specified. So say you specified Verdana and I don't have it for some reason, it'll fall back to Times. And if it doesn't have Times, it'll fall back to serif. So we want to provide as many fallback opportunities as possible, all the way down to just a generic serif, just so the user will be able to see our web page the way we want them to see it. And we also do it for accessibility. So sometimes people have bad internet, so their system won't be able to download whatever latest and greatest font you're using. And they might be using a screen reader or some kind of accessibility device, and not all fonts are very readable. It's also why the Internet Consortium created web-safe fonts. And so ideally, we want to be using web-safe fonts, which are fonts that work on most systems, most browsers, and are accessible. And so ideally, always use web-safe fonts and always have fallback fonts. On the topic of accessibility, images should have an alt property. And so what this means is, I'm not sure what this pic truly is, but say you have a picture of an elephant. You want to add an alt property saying, describing what that picture is. So if it's, there is an elephant walking through the forest. This way, when a user can't access your image for some reason, whether it's accessibility or they have bad internet or your link is broken, they'll still be able to tell that there was supposed to be a picture there and the picture has an elephant walking through the forest. And that way you're not counting out anybody from accessing your website or the information you have. Except we have forms. So here's a pretty basic but comprehensive form HTML code. And so you start off with form action. So we're calling action page.php. You don't have to worry about this part too much, but you do have to know what this is. So we're using the get protocol to, we're calling the action page with the get protocol. So that's the type of method we want to use. And then we declare a field set, which encapsulates or contains all of our labels and inputs. We also have a legend here. What the legend does, it tells us to use, so personalia is a legend here. It's a caption for our field set. So all these fields are going to be, uh, that's just a name for all the fields we have. So it's a way to organize data. So you can call this whatever you want, but it's a caption for this field set. And then we have a bunch of labels and inputs. Okay, so an input element is the most commonly used form element because that's forms are taking in data, inputs help us take in data. So in this case, the input is a text box. The default type, so if you don't give it any type, so these ones, they declare this is a type text, this is a type text. If you don't give it a type text, it's gonna be a type text by default. But we just want to be as readable and verbose as possible so that when somebody is reading through the code, they know exactly what they're dealing with. So that's why we type it in there. Notice that each input field must have a name attribute. And so the name attribute for this first field, first name, is fname. And so that is what helps the back end tie this information. So when the whole purpose of this is to send information to the back end system that's processing this information. And so once you hit submit, the backend system actually gets a key value pair. So it's going to get something like fname equals. That's what's going to the backend when you hit submit. And so if you don't give it a name, then there will be no information going to the backend. It'll be broken. So inputs must have the name attribute. And then if you want to give it a default, you might have sometimes seen, like if you had a phone number, there's an example of a phone number in the box. And so that's how you would do that here. You would just add a value property and enter the value you want to show in there. So enter name here is going to show enter name in the text box. We also have some other types of inputs like type email. And so this one handles email validation right out of the box. So as soon as I add that and you press submit, the HTML or the browser will start checking to see if somebody entered a valid email or not. It won't actually test whether the email belongs to somebody or not. It'll test whether it has like the @ sign and a period. Same with type date, gives us a date picker out of the box. So that's pretty cool. So there's a lot of different types of inputs we can use for forms. The label tag defines a label for many form elements. So each of our input tags has a label next to it. As you can see up here, there's the input, there's a label, there's the input, there's the label. And so it just helps because screen readers, when they're accessing this page on a web browser, the screen reader will actually read out loud first name box. And so again, going on the topic of accessibility, we want to add labels wherever we can for screen readers, and also because when checkboxes or radio buttons are too small to press on a screen, they can just you could just press a label that's tied to that input, and then it'll select the checkbox or radio button as well. And how it does that is in the label, you put which input it's for. So you're going to put for email, and if the name is email, then it's going to be married to it, and then that's how the browser knows this label is for this input. Next up, we have another type of input that actually doesn't use the input tag, so that's kind of unique. There's a select element, which is a drop-down list. And so select helps you pick one out of many options. So here it says the label is choose a car, and then it has a select tag, and it has a bunch of options that you pick one of those options. And you submit, and it's going to submit that value of the car that you picked. Next up, we have radio buttons. So this is another one that lets us pick out of many different choices. So you have input type radio. And so in this case, when the user touches a label, it'll pick that radio value. So that's super helpful. There's also a bunch of other ones, like checkboxes is missing here. But you could have an input type checkbox, and then you could select multiple instead of just one. And lastly, we're going to cover tables. And so your tables are always going to be inside a table tag, and then you have head, body, and foot. And so you can see down here, you don't always have to have all three of these, but you can often find all three of these. And so you have a head at the top, then you have the T body, and then finally you have the footer, which summarizes this information. And so the T head encapsulates all the rows in the header. T body encloses all the rows of the body. T foot encloses all the rows of the foot, the footer. Then you have TR, which is a row. So then you have inside your T body and your T head, you're going to have TRs, which is just one row. So we have just one row here, TR. We have one row down here. In the body, we have two TRs. That's why we have two rows. And so for every row you want to add a new TR tag. Then is TD, which is data. So inside the T row, we're going to add TDs. In this case, we also added THs to show donuts and stationery. So that's a T header, and then we added the cell by doing TD. Next up, we have col span and row span. And so if you ever played with Excel and you've merged cells across multiple columns or rows, this is how you would do it in the HTML web. And so if you increase the col span, it'll make the cell merge across columns. And so this is one column, this is another column. If I increase the col span of donuts to 2, it will not just be in here, it'll be in here also, so donuts will spread out. Same with row span. If I increase a row span of totals, it's not just going to span one row, it could span 2 or 3 rows. So if I turn it to row span of 2, it'll cover stationery and tools, so it'll take up these two. And so that's how you would merge across cells or rows. And then lastly, by default, T headers, THs are center aligned. And so you can see all these headers are center aligned. But then TDs are left aligned. And over here, they're not because CSS was used to artificially center them. But by default, TD elements will always be left aligned. So this is a good amount of content on the exam. I would encourage you to go over the reading material that's out there. So for each lesson, if you go into the required reading and you print out all the lecture notes available in there and go over them before the exam, I think you should do fine. Also have your open notes available around you to reference at the type of the exam. You should have, I believe it's 60 questions on the exam, and I gave you 2 hours, so you should have about 2 minutes a question. So plenty of time. Good luck, everyone. Good luck on the exam.